It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Catherine Ruth Pakaluk, and we're going to be discussing her new book, Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Defying the Birth, Dearth. Catherine, it is truly an honor. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Shaun. It's great to be here.
Well, truly my pleasure. This is my first time meeting you over Zoom. You're going to be brand new, I'm guessing, to 99% of my audience. So let's kick this off by having you share a bit of the Catherine Ruth Pakaluk origin story, superpowers, special abilities, funny stories, something we can remember you by. Share those things with us now.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, well, I guess the most unusual, memorable thing about me is I teach college. I'm a college professor at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., but unusually, I have a lot of kids. So I have 8 children, which has been really the biggest joy and blessing in my life besides my faith. But weirder than that, more memorable than that, a really huge blessing was I married a widower when I was still in graduate school, and he brought 6 children into our marriage. So together we've raised 14 children. Why do I lead with that? In part because it is so unusual. It is out in the public sphere, and a lot of folks are a little uncomfortable to ask me about it. You know, they say, well, I read somewhere that you have 20 kids. No, I read somewhere you have 5 kids. And they can't really, they're not even sure if they should just come out and ask me, or they say, is it offensive to ask? So I just want to get that out. So motherhood has been a huge part of my life, and it's something that, I've prayed a lot about how to combine what I think of and feel deeply is the biggest gift of my life with the academic work that I feel called to do. So I really see college teaching as a privilege and something that's an extension of my motherhood. My husband is also a professor. His name is Michael Pakaluk. And so I sometimes say it's the family business. And what I mean by that is at home, we just discuss about books and ideas all of the time. And often that spills into the dinner table conversation. And so it's really a huge part of our life, our kind of devotion to thinking about truth and discovering the meaning of things. And so our kids share in that. So yeah, we are, I guess, one big happy family with a lot of children at various stages of life. Our youngest is 8 and our oldest from our whole group of 14. Well, I won't give his exact age, but we'll say he's close to 40. Close. And altogether we have, I think, 30 grandchildren that we're looking after. And so, yeah, just to repeat, we both view the gift of family and faith as having colored and shaped profoundly our academic work. And so maybe I'll leave it there.
Wow, that's an impressive range. I mean, I thought I had skills with kids ranging from like 4 to 25, but you beat me on range. And as most of the audience knows now, you may not know this, but my wife did recently pass away from cancer, and so
I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
Didn't know that. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, it was a 2-year journey, but it is funny to think of life as a single dad with 10 kids. So your story gives me hope that there is another person out there who might be wild enough to join me in my
I
journey.
was that person. Yeah, my husband lost his first wife to metastatic breast cancer in 1998. And he's written a little bit about that, which I can maybe share with you later with some links. But I'm truly sorry. But at the same time, yes, it's been a huge, again, it's just a gift and a blessing. I don't talk about these things to boast or to taunt people who haven't been blessed with motherhood, but really just to highlight how much I've been blessed with. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and regardless of whether we're talking 8 kids, 10 kids, 14 kids, I feel like you're stepping into it's a calling to get really beyond 2 or 3 kids.
Yes.
Like you're committing so much time and so many resources, and it's such a huge focus of your life. Like people have often asked me through the years, like, what's it like to have so many kids? And I'm just like, well, if you want to go this path, make sure God has called you this, because it's all consuming, not in a bad way. It's just, it's all of your life. And
that's right. Super intentional. And I think a vocation or calling is the best word for it. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, let's get now into what I like to call the story behind the book. And again, I'm an author. I've acquired books for various publishers for 10 years. So I always am curious, like, man, what set you down this path? Because you could have just written on some of these themes, but You did a
Right.
lot of research, you did interviews. This was no
Yeah.
small project to tackle.
Yeah. This was a really big project. Well, part of the genesis of this book is what we've just discussed, right? So here I am living my life from a young married woman, I becoming adoptive mother to six, and then welcoming our own over the years, and feeling really deeply called to that life of motherhood and being open to children. Um, and then, big families find each other, right? So I met other people along the way, So I was aware that there are all these, big, happy, religious families out there, faith-filled families of different faiths. And in my professional work as an economist, that's a different world. I went to sort of mainstream secular programs. I studied my undergraduate at University of Pennsylvania. These are all schools that have fallen into ill repute of late. University of Pennsylvania, and I did my doctoral work at Harvard. So now I have to say, despite doing my doctoral work at Harvard, but no, I'm proud of the training I received in those days. I studied with really serious people and serious scholars who really were interested in the tough questions. And as an economist, there's sort of no more important question like where people are coming from and who's having babies and how many babies are they having. So, here I am personally invested in a life of family, really dedicated to family in a radical way. And I know that lots and lots of other Americans are. And on my professional side, people were kind of scratching their heads, and there's, definitely been hand wringing for at least 20 years, although people in the know have been hand wringing now for 30 or 40 years about how people are having fewer and fewer children. And so, it was kind of natural to start asking the question, could these two worlds, my personal world and my professional world, have they anything to say to each other? And just to sort of put it in living color real briefly, I'll say that in the professional world, secular, mainstream, whatever you want to call it, demographers and economists and people who think about birth rates, there is this kind of thing where they go, yeah, we know that there's some religious folks out there who still have babies, but they're not really that important for the future of for the future of how we think about the population. And the reason they think that is because they tend not to think that the phenomenon we think of as faith-filled childbearing or religious childbearing, they tend to think of it as basically an irrational project, right? If you just become the kind of person who might happen to be brainwashed by a charismatic pastor or maybe a rabbi or something like that, or you believe something really backwards about birth control or technology, then you might be one of these people who belongs to a breeding cult. That's the kind of language that you use. And I was thinking to myself, gosh, it doesn't describe the people I know. These aren't people who are rejecting modernity. They're not people who believe that women shouldn't go to college, for instance. These are people who've embraced a life of, as you said, like a calling for really personal and really admirable reasons. And there's a lot of human agency. There's a story there. And so I thought, let's see if we could bring that story to the general public, as well as to policymakers, on the grounds that I was convinced that faith communities, I say living religious communities, can have a huge impact on the future of birth rates. So that was the genesis of the book. And then it was kind of working out the details, like who should I talk to and why talk to people as opposed to just doing statistics. Those are all details. But
Well, I've had a lot of strange questions through the years. I don't think my wife and I were ever accused of being part of a birthing cult. That's probably a new concept I'll be
I
pondering
know,
for the
I
rest of
know,
the day. Well, and
I know.
I'm trying to think back just with books I've read and
Hmm.
some different documentaries I watched. Like back, 10 years ago, I remember people were talking about, and this is when still we were pretty early on in our journey with having lots of
Yeah,
kids. Like you
yeah,
needed to have 5 kids to replace you and your spouse, and maybe
right.
do a favor for a few other people
Yeah,
who aren't
right.
having kids. But in terms of where things are trending right now, are we in kind of like a two-child trending towards a one-child? Is it really that bad? I mean, that seems like a dramatic shift from even say 10 years ago.
Yeah. It is a dramatic shift, and yeah, it is that bad. The numbers released for provisional data for 2023 for the United States says about 1.6. So yeah, that is a two-child world, at least trending to a 1.5 child world in the United States. But we know from around the country around the world that we shouldn't assume it will stay at 1.5 or 1.6. You've got countries in Asia that are trending pretty steadily below one. And so I think the wake up call for people in the United States was to realize that we weren't immune from that. When I was a kid, I think in the 90s, people looking at the demographics kind of thought, well, we were the American exception. So Europe was going to go low and Asia was going to go low, but we were kind of different. Yeah.
And in terms of the shift, are you talking about the book? Is it a supply shift? Is it a
Yeah.
demand shift? Is it
Right.
a little of both, depending on how we're
Yeah.
looking at the problem?
Yeah. Great question. So it is, ultimately, I'm going to say it comes down today to a demand shift. What we mean by that is a supply shift would be like everybody still wants to have 2 or 3 or 4 kids, but they can't for some reason. So there's some problem with the supply chain of kids, so to speak. That's what's called a supply problem. And usually we would pin that on, costs. Like people would say, well, housing's too expensive. And so I'll round that out in a minute. Certainly there are some things that we could talk about there. There are things that are obstacles. And one of the reasons people focus on those obstacles or the supply side is because they think that the data we have on demand for children, what we call like desires for children, suggests that people haven't dropped their desire for children by that much. If you ask them when they're young people how many kids they'd like to have, you still see numbers like 2 to 3. And so people just look at that and then they look at, the truly, in many places, high cost of housing or high cost of living, and they say, okay, it's a supply problem. The fundamental problem with citing that desires for children haven't changed over time is that data doesn't ask people the question like, well, if you had to choose between one more kid and one more promotion, or if you had to choose between one more kid or one more vacation, what would you pick? So economists have a notion of revealed preference, that oftentimes what we say we want is not actually that correct. And what we learn we do want is what we learn we want by what we pick. So we reveal our true preferences. And in fact, we actually I think this is a really Christian idea. We actually think that we're not very good judges of our own hearts, of what we truly want. And so when I dig further into some of the existing data, we find out, people want a lot of things that are in conflict. And so when they are forced to choose, and in fact, in lots of profound ways, modern life does force us to choose between children and other things. And it turns out that when forced to choose, people don't tend to choose children, at least not more than about 1.6, right? So now we could talk about what those big costs are. The problem there is, I mentioned things like housing, maybe cost of living in certain places. But really, the real cost, the most important cost that people face is not one that would be very easy to fix on the policy side. And that's what I would call the opportunity cost. So in the 20th century, women go to college and oftentimes graduate school like I did. And so the real cost of raising a child is the time out of the labor market. And that's just one piece of it, is the opportunity cost. And then the other piece of it, of course, is like, gosh, it's really nice to sleep through the night and all those sorts of things. And so you're just sort of thinking like, how bad do I want this, right? How bad do I want this baby? And we do live in a world where babies are an opt-in situation, right? If you don't want to have kids, you don't have to have kids. That's a big, big shift. So yeah, at the end of the day, I come down to the demand side. How much do you want it?
Well, I think too, just generationally, it's like I'm solidly a Gen Xer. The
Yeah,
things
me
that are
too.
important to the people
Yeah.
that are coming up in the few generations that are after us, like
Yeah.
one, the perspective they had on family is very different than what a lot of us saw growing up.
Right.
There's an extreme obsession with individual experiences or going out. Like I think of all the younger people where they have
Yeah.
17 part-time jobs, 9 roommates, and they just go on
Yeah.
vacation all the time. They
Yeah.
work to earn enough
Yeah.
money to travel. And so
Yeah.
I think the things that get them
Yeah.
excited versus when we were coming up, it looks
Right.
different. And just the
Yeah.
that extending childhood forever kind of a thing, just I think
Yes.
of in terms of difficulties of pregnancies in your 30s and your 40s. We have people not getting
Yeah.
married until their late 30s and
Right.
then into their 40s, let
100%.
alone you've led
Yeah.
this epic double income, no kids lifestyle for so long. It's
Right.
it's hard to think of going back. So I feel like to some degree, a lot of folks are they're creating circumstances where it's going to be very difficult to have
Right.
children, let alone if they've
Right.
been on birth control since the beginning of
Right.
time.
Right.
And then their bougie
Yes.
lifestyle. Who wants to
Yeah.
give that up, man? Kids
No.
do take a lot of time and money. So
Yeah.
we're creating difficult situations to even begin having
Yes.
kids, really, let
Yes.
alone how we feel
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah.
What else? Where do I go from here? There's so many places we could go. Cost of a birth too, just I'll say in terms of
Yeah.
whether, fertility treatments is a whole another
Yeah.
bucket you can throw piles of money into. But I think of what it costs to have our ninth and 10th child versus cost of a
Yeah.
birth with our
Mm.
first few child.
Mm.
It's astronomically, like,
Yeah.
talking like 10x what it cost
Yeah.
when we were having our first kids
Yeah.
back 25 years ago. And
Right.
so just that, if you don't have
Yeah.
good insurance, the cost is extensive. I was going to ask about this later in the interview, but you had kind of brought this up, so I'll go here next. Just pressure on young
Mm.
women to get an ROI on their education. I mean, are there
Mm.
parents, people who've sewed into their education, like, you better go out and do something with this because we spent
Yeah.
tens of thousands of dollars. Don't
Yeah.
just go get married and have kids. Like, is that
Right.
pressure on young women real?
Yeah. I think it is. I haven't done any formal research on this, but I'm a college teacher at a Christian university. I hear it all the time from the girls I teach. A lot of times they come to me and they say, Dr. Pakaluk, like you look like you have everything. You have, a great marriage and you've got a lot of kids and you have a job. And I'd like to have all those things too. And I've got this great boyfriend and I want to get married. And then they say, but my mom or my dad says, they've just paid a ton of money and they really want to see me get my master's first or work for a few years first. And you just look at them like, oh man, like, well, I don't know what to say to that. Right. So I think just anecdotally, I would say, I think that pressure is real. But it's the elephant in the room here is that we have an educational system in which we largely, listen, I'm totally in favor of women going to college and beyond. But we largely brought women into an educational pathway that worked for men and their careers and even for men starting families. So this is good. The problem is, like you mentioned earlier, they're getting married now in their 30s or even past that. And if you just look at when people are most fertile and most able to have families, I mean, goodness, like you'd kind of go, gee, like we're doing it wrong. We've got women tied up in school and, basically putting off, I mean, they're not even thinking about marriage, in those years of 18 to 22 in general, and not even until after 25 oftentimes. And so, goodness, that's a huge problem. It's just in terms of like two things that are happening at the same time, and they're really crowding out the most fertile years for young women. But obviously, those are social norms that are going to be really tough to break through, right? I mean, if I went out and started a campaign like for people to like, when they're 18, like marry guys that are 28 so they could start families and have babies and then, get back to college later. That's not going to go over really well. So some of these I think are really big and they're working for people to skip out of the narrative or the script, we'll say, or skip out or be adjusting it. I would say in like smaller kind of micro communities, like places where people all kind of through a religious, like a church or a community, they all kind of accept like, yeah, look, college is great, but go to a college where there's a bunch of other Christians all want to get married and have babies. And so then you're kind of doing it all together. So, I mean, just to say, that, like my son is 20 and got married last summer. He was still just shy of 19 when he got married a girl from his Christian Catholic college. She's from a family of 15. I mean, they finished college, both of them. They are both, they're both pursuing professional work. He's got a full-time job. They just had their first baby last month. I mean, that occurred because why? Because they've grown up and live in communities that kind of understand like there's another way to do things. So they didn't opt out of college, but they did make family a priority.
Yeah, and I think if especially if you feel like you're called to have
Yeah.
a large family, you're just going to make different choices. Like
Right.
my wife finished her college degree before we got married.
Yeah.
I spent a 7-year path getting my 4-year degree just because
Yeah.
I was a husband and a father
You were working.
supporting a
Yeah.
family, so I was.
Yeah.
But it's not impossible. Like
No, it's not impossible.
it's actually. I feel like with what's offered today, it's easier to finish a degree or a master's degree now
Right.
than it
Right.
was, say, 20 years ago.
I think that's right. Yeah.
And I love kids getting married at 18, 19. Man, finish growing up together. Learn how to do
Mhm.
life together.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think kind of related to some of the delays. On the one hand, I'd love to have you comment on kind of our modern birth control situation in the sense that you can switch the capacity to have
Yeah.
children on or off,
On
and
or off.
sort of related but unrelated. And I think this is
Yeah.
a major factor inside and outside the church. Just our modern hookup culture, where people having
Yeah.
sex before marriage is
Yeah.
it's just normalized. There's no shame in it. It
Right.
seems.
Right.
I think back when I was coming up, uh, you know, you just to put it
No.
this crass way, you
Yeah.
weren't, you had to buy the cow to get the
Yeah.
milk kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And now it's just like the milk is free and you never have to buy the cow. It's sad because by the time people do get around to getting married,
Yeah.
they're so damaged and they're so broken. It creates a lot of relational problems down
Yes.
further down the track, if you will. So anyways,
Yeah.
I fell into a ditch there.
Yeah.
But
No.
birth
Those are
control,
all.
hookup culture, like
Yeah.
how is this affecting what we're seeing in terms of
Yeah.
when people are choosing to have kids?
Yeah. I know. I think it's huge. I think it's huge. I mean, so obviously the women I interviewed who are, escaping these dire, dire trends they're having, the families they want to have. Um, if you read through those interviews in general, there's a few exceptions, people who, either hooked up or moved in together before they got married. But then they have a conversion later. I mean, so in general, these are stories of people who do view marriage in a biblical sense. Sex is for marriage, and it's the it's the basis on which you build your relationship, not something that you just play around with like for 10 years first. I mean, those things go together. I would certainly want to highlight the work of a friend of mine at University of Texas, Austin, Mark Rigneris. He wrote a really depressing book, if you want a depressing book on this, called Cheap Sex. And I think he totally describes what you're describing, the combination of, basically sex before marriage and cohabitation, for, kind of easy, effective, reversible birth control, which makes it, much more low risk to get involved in that way, pornography and sort of dating apps like, Tinder and so on. And he says, look, this like kind of triple threat of these things together, it really reduces the incentive that young men used to have to get married. And it sounds crass to put it that way. I've had people write me sort of not exactly hate mails, but we'll say like angry mails, like, you don't really think that guys would ever work for any reason except to get married and have sex. Like, what do you think men are? And I'm like, well, I mean, no, that's true. I think men are they're very noble characters. But I mean, we can't deny that in God's plan, the goodness of coupling up, it has a purpose. And when I look at my son, who, like I said, got married, when he met his future bride, Mary, when he was 18, and I will tell you, I've got 3 sons about the same age. We're all in college at the same time. And if you ask me which one of them worked hardest in the next 2 years, it was the one who wanted to get married because he'd met the pearl of great price. I mean, he had. And certainly in our family culture, that sex is something you save for marriage, and building a family together is something you save for marriage. So, I mean, man, he became a man on a mission, which was to get his college degree in 2 years, to get a job, to save every penny, not to spend anything on anything frivolous. And that was all, with the view to wanting to be worthy of marrying Mary, who, and so, man, does that sound old fashioned and traditional, but it's still possible. So I just want to say, yes, I think the hookup culture and all these other sort of alternative ways of exploring adulthood, and we even give them all these weird names. It's a huge piece of this story. It is.
Well, and I think so many people looking at that kind of data, they want to rationalize their own choices, their own
Yeah.
decisions. And so
Yeah.
a lot of people are just trying to come to terms with the path that they chose. And
Yeah.
I mean, if we're honest
Right.
with ourselves and we
Yeah.
know young men, there's nothing better than a beautiful young woman to be like,
Yes.
wow, I need to stop having roommates. I need to get a better
Yep.
job.
Yep.
I need a nicer car, all the stuff. I mean, we've
Yep.
all seen it where it all of a sudden propels a man to greatness because, like you said, kind
Totally.
of that
Yep.
pearl of great price. He has
Hmm.
found an object of
Yep.
desire and affection that is worth
Yep.
whatever it
Yes.
costs.
Whatever it
And
costs.
that's an admirable thing. It's a beautiful
It's
thing. It's not
wonderful.
something we
Yep.
should be
Yep.
shameful or weird about. I think it just feels really
Hmm.
abnormal. Just because it
Yep.
wasn't. I love what you've described in terms of these are the things that are valued in your family and in the
Yep.
family of where your daughter-in-law came from. Like, I
Hmm.
love that those influences still
Yep.
exist some places because
They
culturally
do.
we just don't put any value on any of that.
Yeah.
Even
That's right.
inside the church, a lot of this
Right.
stuff isn't
Right.
valued. Like I just think of like what it must be like. And again, I think I'm gonna have my first daughter get engaged this summer and
Great.
probably married next year. But
Great.
I can only imagine how
Hmm.
awkward if people will even ask for your daughter's hand in marriage anymore these
Yeah.
days. Like how
Yeah.
weird are those conversations? So you have 3 part-time jobs and you live with 6
Yeah.
roommates and all the
Yeah.
like how do those conversations go? That like trying to find a young man who's gonna like live up to a minimal bar
Right.
must be a challenge. I
Yeah.
think whether it's, in our own families or even I think of
Yeah.
myself entering the dating space again and looking at getting remarried, we need to have a high
Yeah.
standard, and we need
Yeah.
to really
Yes.
put on display what something of character and maturity and
Yeah.
doing it under kind of God's umbrella can really look like. And,
Yeah. And
let's, yeah, go ahead.
well, I was gonna say, I think this is a moment, just generally for Christians to really affirm the wisdom of these things. Eh, like you said, there's no shame in these things. More than that, I mean, just to kind of say, look, I mean, there's a wisdom in God's plan. I mean, God placed these things in our hearts to begin with. He also gave us a couple of boundaries, and they're pretty clear. They're pretty clear. So we're out here like looking at the sociological data, trying to sort of reinvent biblical wisdom. I mean, and actually, when we look around, you look at the kind of the damage of the hookup culture, you look at the damage of broken homes and broken families. I mean, what do we have to be ashamed about? I mean, goodness gracious, right? It's not like the throwing away the biblical traditions has like led to this, paradise of human thriving. Right? So,
All right, we'll finally get to the interview. We could go so many
yeah,
directions just because I feel
sure,
like we're playing in
of
the
course.
space that has been my life for so many years.
Yeah. Yeah.
How did you discover the people that you interviewed? Were they all particularly religious on purpose? Did they just turn out
Yeah.
to be that way? Like, what were some of your criteria for finding the folks that
Right.
you feature in the book?
Yeah. So I had just a couple criteria. I was looking for people who had 5 or more children. Why 5? It's arbitrary. I just wanted people who are doing something really different from the 1.6. And so you don't want people who had 3 because they were trying for a boy or trying for a girl, and you don't like, 4 could still be sort of trying for something. Because you can't go out and pick people for interviews knowing what's in their heart. You don't know. All you know is like how many kids they have and that kind of thing. So I picked 5 just to pick, people. Too bad I didn't find you. Just people who are super different. And so you go around. We picked our locations and we said, all right, well, where are the people with the kids? Like you got to find them. So we went to we kind of asked around in different cities, like what are the churches known to be really super family oriented churches? And in every state or city you go to, people always know. They're like, oh yeah, that synagogue, oh yeah, that church or whatever. So it's true that in general, we found people near or attached to churches. We would send a survey flyer around to points of contact in these different communities. So we didn't require that people were religious. Of course, a lot of them were. In fact, everybody we interviewed had some religious community that they were attached to, but they varied in how devout they were and how much they practiced. With the least devout person in the book was a kind of a less devout Jewish lady who's got a great interview and a great story, and her husband wanted a lot of kids. And we really enjoyed her a lot. Now, we know that across the country, that's true, that most people who have more than average children do practice some kind of faith. So that was okay for me. The goal of the book wasn't to get a quote unquote representative sample. The goal was to find people who do look like they're deviating from the normal family size and really try to dig in and find out why. So yeah, most of them were religious. They varied in how much religious practice they pursued. But one of the big benefits of this was to kind of see like exactly in what way do these biblical or religious traditions influence their choices and decisions. So yeah, that's how we picked. And in each city, we had 50 or 60 applications, and then we would look at those applications for people to want to take the study. And we would pick based on some reasonable amount of diversity. We didn't want everybody from the same church. We didn't want everybody from the same creed. We didn't want everybody to be the same, racial or ethnic background. So we picked kind of what we thought was a nice selection. We didn't interview anybody we knew. That was obviously another thing. These weren't my 5 friends, So.
And then, I don't know. I haven't as often heard of it was the husband's vision necessarily to have a
Yeah,
large family. So
correct.
with the different couples you connected with,
Yeah,
was there a variation? Because like in my case, my wife
yeah,
felt like she was supposed to homeschooling mom, large family, her
yes,
life dream and vision since like 2 or 3 years old. Like she wanted
yeah,
this large
yeah,
family. So she felt
yeah,
like it was her calling. I kind of just went along for the ride. It's like, yeah,
yes,
6 kids sounds good. And we overachieved and
yep,
had 10.
yep.
So did it seem to be one spouse or the other? Did some arrive
Mhm.
there together? What'd that look like?
Yeah. So I would say that you and your wife were very typical of the families that I met. I would say that in general, it was, I wouldn't say, so some of the wives approach marriage the way your wife did. Like they knew from when they were really young that they super wanted to have a lot of kids. That it was in their heart, or maybe their family background, but they really did. Many of them didn't know from a young age, but they did know they wanted to prioritize family. And so what that looked like for them was, and this was probably the most common thing I heard was, well, in our family, of course, I was interviewing the women. They would say things like, well, my husband is okay with whatever I want. If I feel ready for the next child, he's ready to support.
That is such a typical, whatever
right?
you want, dear. I don't have an opinion on that, even though
exactly.
they want you to have an opinion on it. Thank you very much.
Exactly. No, it's true. So, and I did say that the husbands in this group are, people like you, pretty unusual, right? A lot of husbands wouldn't be ready to support their wife going into like 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 children. So these are pretty unusual men who I'd like to study separately. That's a lot. The most common request I get is, can you do the sequel? Can you do the baby daddies of the of the Hannahs? So we'll see if I get the energy to do that. But I would say so. All but one of the ladies in my sample would have described that they were kind of in the driver's seat in terms of but many of them talk about a mutual process of praying and discerning between, are they ready for another one? And so certainly they describe themselves as being for running over their husbands, but that they came to some agreement. So those are some of the pieces of it, because of course it's not easy to just reduce a childbearing decision to one thing. The one case, which was the outlier in my sample, was the case where coming into marriage, it was the husband of the woman I interviewed who really had a prior idea that he wanted to have 9 children. And she presents that as completely blowing her away when they were dating. She was completely freaked out by that. But at the end of the day, when we pressed her on it, she said, well, I really love my husband and he doesn't ask me for anything else. He doesn't ask me to do his laundry or cook for him. He does those things for himself. We have a great marriage. We enjoy each other a ton. And this is something that he wants. And I see the goodness in it. So that was a really cool story. But that was certainly the outlier.
Yeah. And you've implied throughout the conversation that your sample tended to be religious, whether heavily practicing or some may be a little bit more nominal. Did you see any common threads in terms of a theology of large families? Like my wife had captured a vision through a friend of ours, Nancy Campbell, who has a ministry called Above Rubies. And early on, she was a big influence in my wife's journey. And her vision was always, I'm going to have as many children as God will give me or allow me to have, which seems to be fairly common in a lot of the homeschooling kind of circles I've been a part of through the years. But in terms of your sample size, was there any kind of one or two theological threads that maybe helped them come to terms with this vision that they were acting out, so to speak?
Yeah, exactly. I'll try to put a couple of different pieces of language on that. What I found was that, of course, I was looking for common threads across, 60 different women, Jewish, Christian, Catholic, Mormon, a variety of different Christian denominations. And I would say that as many children as God sends is a great way to put it. But I wouldn't say that I could point to a single source. It wasn't one single text or one single. So I really wanted to capture the sense in which it has a kind of biblical origin. This is why the book is called Hannah's Children, because I thought that the biblical Hannah was a great sort of archetype for this. The Jewish women that I talked to, and I will say that I think the religious Jewish tradition being the source, I think, of the multiple Christian traditions ultimately through the scriptures. The Jewish women I talked to had this language of, children are one of the 3 big blessings that we are supposed to ask God for. And that of the 3 big blessings that God can send, children is the first one of them. So children, health, and financial sustenance. Those are the 3 big blessings that they speak about in the Jewish tradition. And what the Jewish lady said was, you can't have too many of any of those things or too much of any of that, right? So you can't have too many kids and you can't have too much health and you can't have too much wealth. So I would say that it took different expressions. Some people wanted to go after 9 or 10. That was not actually super common. What most of the time that looked like was that they understood themselves as women and as couples as being essentially vessels to receive a blessing that God might send to them. And that they had different ways of knowing when they would be ready to participate or to sort of like we'll say cooperate or unlock that next blessing. So it's really hard to do this, right? Because our modern language of wanting and choosing speaks about things like consumer demand. We think about consumer demand where you go out and you want like another pair of shoes. So they would speak not about wanting another pair of shoes, but rather like being open to receive the pair of shoes if God blesses you. So of course, we know that fertility and our childbearing, it's deeply a mystery, and it's something we have to do certain things where like my kids are always like, don't you want another baby, mom? And I'm like, I'm doing my part, you have to do something. But of course, that ultimately it's the mystery. And so I would say that language of openness, and that language of openness, I would just want to add one more piece of theological foundation. That language of openness went along with this idea that kind of God is the author of all things and very much the author of our families and our marriages. And so they use language of like, well, we talk about Planned Parenthood. Well, that's like a very different mentality. But the ladies often said, what do you mean by planned? Like not planned by me or not planned by us, but planned by God. And so that's another one of those difficult things. I tried to take pains to describe this. It didn't mean that these women were generally not planning their families in some sort of reckless sense. They were praying about each child and thinking about it and trying to space their children in ways that made them healthy and well. So they were definitely, as far as I could see, not irresponsible in whatever that would look like, but that they were super, how would I put it? Yeah, super open to being blessed, and that they always viewed children as in the blessing bucket, like not in the sort of liability bucket. Does that make sense? Right?
Yeah,
So
don't start viewing the kids as a curse. It's going to make it a lot harder.
correct. Yeah, correct. And so some people I've talked to, they say, well, were you trying to say that the people that you researched, like they love their kids more than I do? And of course I said, no, that's not what I'm trying to say. And they would say, well, I really value kids. I really value my one or my two or whatever. And I say, no, like I'm definitely not trying to say that. But what I am saying is that it's a different type of mentality that says, hey, if a stranger knocked on my door in the middle of the night and showed up with a van full of kids, it's here's 8 kids that their parents just dropped dead or whatever happened, that you would actually just be really ready to open your door, like get out the mattresses. Like it's a completely comprehensible idea that you basically view yourself as open. It's like almost like hospitality, because people are never the problem. People are always a blessing.
And I think that's one of the reasons people struggle when they see a family with large kids, because
Mm-hmm.
if for whatever reason they feel convicted to question or
Yeah.
wrestle with their own choices. And I had a season before I got into publishing where I met a lot of retired folks when I lived
Mm-hmm.
and worked in Florida in that particular job
Mm-hmm.
circumstance. And when these grandmas and grandpas would find out I had a lot of kids, all of them, no matter who it was, they said, wow, I wish I'd had so many more kids. I
Mm-hmm.
had my one kid or my 2 kids, and they
Yeah.
don't even want to have kids, and I'm sad I don't have any grandkids. Like everybody's
Yeah.
regret in that
Right.
demographic at that time in my life, like they all wish they'd had a lot more kids, which I thought was
Right.
pretty
It's super
in
interesting.
this particular retirement community. These were multimillionaire, very
Yeah.
established, well-to-do, like they'd had the career, they'd lived the life, and none
Mm,
of them lamented about not making enough money or all these things. They just
right.
all said, man, you're blessed. I wish I'd had that
Right.
many more kids. So I think someone's perspective based on
Yep.
who we're talking to, and I love the language of you used of just being open to be a vessel. I would say, as I
Yeah.
watched my wife across the trajectory of birthing 10 children,
Mm-hmm.
as she got more past 4 and into 5 and
Yeah.
into 6, I feel like being able to keep doing it became much more of a spiritual.
Mm,
I am partnering with God to create a new life. Like her theology around it seemed to be more solid and established.
yeah.
I think to have the
Yeah.
courage to keep going
For sure. For sure.
along the journey. And so I think that's maybe something that people miss when they're kind of
Yeah.
outside of the bubble of this lots of kids world, is for a lot of the moms and the dads too, but more so the moms, like there is this partnering with God element that is
Yeah.
intense
Yep.
and real. And,
Yep.
it goes beyond just praying into it. Like
Correct. Yeah.
God is on the journey with you, if you
Yes.
will.
Yes.
In terms of the people you looked at, Did you see more kind of single breadwinner family situations, or
Hmm.
were any of those moms doing much outside the home or running a business at home? I imagine there had to be at least some variety based on your sample size.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a good amount of variety. I think this is something I'm remiss in having come up with the exact percentage, but I think at least 30% of the women must have had some type of a full-time job. If not at the time of the interview, then previously to the interview. Some of the women, while I was interviewing them, were holding full-time jobs, or a couple of college professors, or there was a doctor, um, at least one lawyer that I can remember. Um, and then others of them had previously held full-time jobs for a couple of years and then kind of had that moment where it was like, actually, this isn't going to keep working. And then there was a lot, like I would say the mushy middle of my sample was a lot of, piecing together part-time work. And I think that's, of course, just important to have like the historical perspective. I mean, I think in the trajectory of history, women staying home raising their kids have often contributed to family enterprises, on the farm or other kinds of domestic industries. And it's only become kind of a weirder conflict in the era when you go out to work somewhere else. And kind of to your point earlier, I would say that a lot of women reported doing work that was remote, on a part-time basis at home, using whatever talents or interests they had. So yeah, a huge variety. And then, yeah, certainly like a good percentage of them, at least, 30 or 40% were stay-at-home, full-time moms, certainly a lot of homeschoolers that I met. Um, and because that makes a lot of sense. One woman in particular described, and I think she had 10 when I interviewed her. I met her recently, and was super delighted to find out she'd had two more. So she was holding baby 12 when I met her. But she was an interesting story in the sense that they had started out their family with their kids in a local Christian school. But they got to a point where she describes, and I think I read about this in the book. She says, well, I looked at my husband and we thought, well, we're kind of getting to that point where it's like, it's either more kids or they stay in Christian school. We can't do both because we're hitting that tuition limit. And she says, well, we looked at each other and was like, well, choice is easy. Well, we're going to be homeschoolers. So, we'd rather have another child in homeschool than, so sometimes that homeschooling choice was a vocational choice regarding just a call to educate at home. And sometimes that decision to homeschool was related in particular to their family sizes. Yeah.
Yeah, we had a few of our kids in a Christian school.
Yeah.
Once my wife got sick, and then once you're paying for 2, 3 kids tuition, it's like
Yeah.
more
It's
than
a
half a
lot.
paycheck, folks.
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely some economic considerations there.
Right. Right.
Uh,
Right.
Throughout the conversation, we've implied a lot of people's convictions in this space
Mm.
tends to lean towards faith. Did you meet any people who were trying to do their part to kind of battle
Yeah.
the economic collapse that people feel like is pending, or the demographic collapse? Anybody have a leg on that side of the fence?
So, I would just have to be honest. I didn't meet anybody who was motivated for that reason. There are certainly people who felt that was their favorite sort of justification when people attack them in public, right? So, because people did feel attacked in public, some, in the grocery store, and people say, "Oh, like you're ruining the planet," or, "Oh," people said they got those things a lot, and so some of them had familiarized themselves with the demographic, kind of facts, and liked to cite those when they felt that they had to justify their choices. But I didn't meet anybody that was having kids to save the planet or save the country. Which was interesting in itself, right? Because I think that today some of the public discussion about, what the nature of conservatism is, people have worried, we'll say, about a kind of, we'll just say, secular right wing natalism or populism. People worry about, I don't know, Christians wanting to build armies or whatever, So in other words, I didn't find that. I didn't find people that were out kind of ready to populate God's army or America's army or whatever. I just didn't find it. I kind of probed for it, but I didn't find it.
Yeah, and I'll say the weird, funny, strange, offensive things people say to you.
Yeah.
You never know what you're going to get. I would say by and large, the moms get the brunt of the abuse. Like, people
Yeah.
just tend to say really
This is
rude things to
amazing.
women. I probably have gotten 80% like um decent responses in terms of, like,
Yeah.
through the years, be
Yeah.
like, oh wow, that's amazing. Sometimes if you're sitting up in first class on an airplane, depending on who you're meeting,
Yeah.
a lot
Yeah.
of times I found people who are up front really aren't pro large families have had some of my strangest conversations up there.
Yeah.
But yeah, especially for the moms,
Yeah.
you guys
Yeah.
get the brunt of all the
Yeah.
odd. Like for you with your size family, what's the
Hmm.
strangest thing or like the most offensive thing somebody's just, and these are strangers in public wanting to comment on your fertility and your family. Like, I don't know you from Adam. Why are you talking to me?
I know it's so weird. I would never walk up to somebody and be like, "Wow, so you stopped at one? That's so weird. Why'd you stop at one?" Like, right? So there's something. No, obviously, what that indicates is that on the one, other people's choices aren't so obvious, right? So there's something when you have 8 children, or 10 or 3, basically people can see the effect of your choice. If you choose to stop, nobody knows, right? Like nobody actually knows. So there is a way in which it's it's a vulnerable place. Um, right? Like, and so that's interesting. It 100%, I don't know why, but it definitely calls forth this kind of like need to speak about, like, people just walk up to you and tell you like, "Oh, well, I just made the ultimate decision and that's why I'm still walking funny." And you're like, "Really?" Like, this is a guy in a carpet store said this to me, like, like, "Oh, you're having your third. You look super pregnant. I just had my operation." And you're like, "I don't want to know, and I don't care, and I don't care to judge you. Just keep it to yourself." So I did. I asked all the women to tell me about their most memorable story. And maybe they can just share the most memorable line I ever got, which was very odd. And I didn't expect. And it's part of what motivated this book. Was I was on a train once with my sixth, who's just a couple months old, and it was a commuter train, a lot of working people after work. And so, there's not babies on that train. So it drew a lot of attention to hop on that train with a baby in a little sack on the front. It's just his head was sticking out, and everybody's like, "Oh, a baby." And this lady said, "Wow, is it your first?" And I said, "No, it's my sixth." And then there's this like mic drop moment, where people are like, "Oh, they don't know what to say." And then the lady who asked me, she paused and she said, "Wow, I guess your husband still wants you." And I was like, I didn't know what to say. I don't even think I said anything. I was just completely blown away. Of course, part of me was like, "Yep, he does." But it really made me sad. I thought, like, where's that coming from? Is that coming from a place of real sadness? And it was definitely the first time I thought, like, is there a relationship between like marital quality and how open we are to our fertility? You know, I just didn't know, but yeah, that was really shocking to me.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like a comment that would come out of a place of pain and just
Right, right. Tragic
very
somehow. Right.
interesting.
Yeah,
Where to go as we try to wrap up here.
yeah.
In terms of like growth over over the
Hmm.
long haul, having a large family, like did the moms weigh in at all on ways that just having this many kids like grew them or changed them? Like you can't
Yeah.
help but be different than
Right.
when you started, man, because it's a
I
journey.
know. I know. One of the moms said, which I thought was really funny about her husband. She was really waxing on about how great her husband is. And she sort of paused at some point. She said, "Well, really, the truth is, if you have a bunch of kids, like you've got 5 or 6 kids, your husband is either going to become a rock star or he's going to become a total ass." And I was like, "Well, okay, you probably have a point there." But of course, she felt that her husband had become a real rock star, and that she was describing how she was way more attracted to him at the time of our interview than at the time when they first got married. And people use language like, these experiences of really having to grow as a person. You've got to grow to meet these needs. And of course, you have to meet the needs. You created the needs. Like you brought this child into existence. Who are you not gonna wake up in the middle of the night and feed this baby? So you create these needs. You try, you're very bad at it, but you try to meet those needs. And what happens is you grow, right? Just like everything great stretch is a stretching, right? Like, and people do this all the time for other things, like, hiking mountains and losing weight and lifting weights and like all these things. Like you get it. You have to break stuff down to make way for growth. So they talked about how the thing we would expect to happen does happen if you take it on, and with responsibility, you grow a lot. And then the cool thing, which they talked about, was like, well, not only had they become better persons, they felt like that, their selfishness had gotten smaller, that they had become able to do things they didn't think they could do before. They'd found meaning and identity that they may have been searching for when they were younger, a kind of peace. And ultimately, that because they'd become better, they were more attracted to each other, so their marriages were better. And then I think maybe the last thing that came up a lot was the way in which in a sense, it's like an unintended consequence, but an unintended good consequence. Not sometimes there's unintended bad consequences of things, but maybe an unintended consequence for them was that their teenagers and their older children were really deeply formed by growing up with a huge, set of siblings. And so not only they became better, but they looked at their teenagers and said, yeah, wow, like these are teenagers who you don't have to tell them like, oh, can you pour the milk for this person? They're just doing it by nature. They're looking out for who's the person more needy than I am. And what's really interesting is if you have a 13-year-old who is used by habit to kind of look out for somebody more weak, more vulnerable, well, all of a sudden that's the 13-year-old who's closer to growing up. And here we are looking around with a nod of the head to people like Abigail Schreier, people asking these deep questions about like, why do we have a generation of kids that are like 20, 25 and they can't launch and they don't know how to take care of anything? So here's this really cool kind of unintended consequence was the idea that like your children are also benefited by growing up with lots of siblings in terms of their character. So yeah, lots and lots of stories. It was hard to cut it down to just a few that could fit in the book. But I sort of felt like maybe that was like this another sequel that could be done, kind of about like what it's like to grow up that way and how it makes you different. And what's beautiful about it is it makes you different in a way that isn't something you could be proud of, like an accomplishment, right? It's not like, I don't know, it's not like these kids are like, oh, I checked a box. There's like a shiny resume, you know what I mean? Like, it's more, again, it's just like that humility of, it's just the deck of cards like life handed to me, or in this case, God handed to us. And then really, it's like you look, I don't know. I mean, I think sickness does this to us too, right? It's like part of God's plan. Sickness, you wouldn't wish sickness on anybody, but born with the spirit of acceptance, we see that sickness makes us better people. And so that was what kind of the message that came out of this was like, well, you wouldn't have a bunch of kids to make yourself a better person. That's not why you would do it. Right? You do it because you love your spouse, you love God, you believe that God's wisdom is better than your own wisdom. But then you kind of look back and you go, wow, like, well, this is why it's God's wisdom. Like, there's all these unintended benefits here, and how cool is that?
Well, and this is sort of an unrelated path, but I would even say in terms of my wife's cancer journey and caring for her
Yeah,
for almost 2 years, the controlled chaos of a household with 10 kids for 20 plus years
yeah,
made taking care of her just another thing to add on. But it not to say it
yeah,
wasn't difficult, but
yeah,
we're used to complex. We're used to just a lot going on. And so I think
yeah.
in the same way it prepares our children to be ready to
Or,
take on more as they get into the world. I feel like as a spouse, it can
yeah,
grow you to be able to take on
yes,
just that much more because it's
yeah.
just you're normal. You're used to having lots of people to care
That's
for
right. That's right.
24/7 as that goes.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the best analogy I can think of is like guys who, like guys who are in the special forces, and when they come out and they, they're ex-military and you're like, oh, special forces. I mean, why do we think that's cool? Well, we're like, well, we know that if you kind of manage that level of demand, okay, like you're probably going to be able to tackle a lot of other things with a great deal of just like you're not going to be overstressed. You've got so yeah, it is like that. It's a kind of special forces effect or something like that. But again, not in a spirit of arrogance or pride, but like in a spirit of humility. Like God blessed us in this way, and one of the neat things about God's blessings is that they overflow in ways that we don't initially expect. So yeah,
Well, in terms of your reader takeaway, reader's journey with the
yeah,
book, I think on the one hand, a lot of people are going to find one or two people who's like, they're like, oh my gosh, I
yeah,
see myself in that story and that story. But
yes,
big
yeah,
picture, you're like, man, every
yeah.
reader, this is the thing they need to see. Like, what do you want every reader
Hmm.
to take away?
Yeah. Maybe I'll offer two related things. One is just on the personal level. The story is really in the very back part of the book, related to healing. I think that was a surprise to me. The number of people who reported that babies and children in their lives had an unexpected healing effect on them. I think we're really more deeply aware today than in the past of our need for healing, and we've never imagined that our children could be sources of healing for us. And I think that that's probably a deep truth. So that's the personal takeaway that I think people need to see and look at. And it's definitely what most surprised me in my interviews. I didn't expect to find it. And I explained some of that in the last couple of chapters. The big picture takeaway, I think, from my perspective as an economist and someone who talks to a lot of policymakers, is is actually that there's like a gospel of hope here. Um, you know, what's not hopeful is that the policymakers all say, well, we've tried everything. We can't raise the birth rates. We can't pay people to have kids. We've tried all these policies, like we can extend maternity leave and do all these things. And it doesn't really seem to make a dent. That there is something that can make a dent, right? Which is that, spreading the gospel in a really concrete way and like sharing the joy and the beauty of this lifestyle. Like in a sense, it's like you couldn't have predicted, right? If you were sitting around just before Jesus Christ was born, just before his crucifixion and death and resurrection, you wouldn't have predicted that Christianity would change the world, right? Like you can't predict the effects of evangelization. And so sitting around, I think there's a lot of bad news about birth rates and a lot of bad news about family formation. I actually think the church is sitting on the actually like single most powerful lever that we have, which is the faith. And so I think the big takeaway is kind of like, there's a lot of good news in these stories. And I'd like people to feel encouraged and inspired by it. Like to just sharing the good news of our families can lead other people to just change and do those things as well. Because like, why not? Like, why not try family? Right?
I'm intrigued. I want to get to the healing aspect in a second, but one of the things I think culturally we've just created our own hell in the sense of choosing to go down this path with large family. It's largely a worldview issue, I think.
That's right.
On the one hand, but we need to stop telling people to deconstruct their family of origin, deconstruct their faith, deconstruct their country. Like all younger folks that especially came up after us, they're told all those things are bad, and so so many people, they have no mooring. They don't know where they came from. They don't know where they are. They don't know where they're going. Therefore, anything that you can be a part of sounds pretty flashy and exciting, which explains so much of what we see happening in culture right now. I think in terms of the healing aspect, it is countercultural to have a large family. I mean, that's no secret. But one of the things that was huge for me and my wife was to break generational cycles. We come out of families of divorce. My parents were never married. And when we got started, we're like, A, divorce will never be an option. And B, we're just going to try to give our kids a foundation to start out on that we just absolutely never had. And so I think that's not only can it be healing for you as a couple, individually and together, I think healing your family line, there's a real opportunity to stand in the face of the cultural pressure, just get divorced, 3 different marriages, all the mess. Because let me tell you, kids who grew up in that stuff, they'll tell you how awful Christmas is and everything else. Like just, so I feel like on one hand, individual healing, but breaking generational cycles of garbage. There's a real family line opportunity there. In terms of people finding you, finding out more about the book, all the things, where are the places we can discover you on the web?
Well, I'm new to the scene, so to speak, if there is a scene. I spent 5 years writing a book, so I was out of the scene. But I have a new website, catherine.pakaluk.com. Currently, this book and the Audible version is on Amazon, which is an easy find and just a click away. But I'm building my website. And besides that, of course, I'm at the Catholic University of America, and you can find me pretty easily there. So all of the above, but thank you. And I'm always happy to get feedback and to try to correspond with people who write.
And I'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description and the show notes to websites mentioned, as well as places where you can pick for your very own copy of this new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Catherine Ruth Pakaluk. Once again, our book today was Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Defying the Birth, Dearth. And Catherine, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
Welcome, Shaun.